This is Talk Radio.
Keeping you up to date across the UK. Online, on DAB+, and on the Talk Radio app.
Rob Rinder on Talk Radio.
Good afternoon, everybody, as we head into 5:30. I'm with you till 7 o'clock on drive time. And it's a complex range of political issues. We've got everything from Afghanistan to political panel. We're joined by Mike Buckley, journalist and campaigner, and Joseph Silke, communications officer at Bright Blue. It's difficult to know where to begin, but I think it's important, bearing in mind what's happening in Afghanistan and with President Biden about to have yet another press conference, maybe his performance will be better this time, to reflect on Afghanistan. Thinking about it, I'm going to start with you, Mike Buckley. Do we think that the USA, bearing in mind what's happened, is still the UK's closest ally?
Well, I was just talking to somebody earlier today, actually, who kind of works in international relations, and she was saying that relations between the British government and the US government are at an all-time low. Now, whether it's true that they really are at an all-time low, I don't know, but I think it's certainly true that they're not in a good state. And we knew this as soon as Biden came in. I mean, we knew that there was bad blood, for want of better language, maybe, between Biden and Johnson personally, in part due to remarks that Johnson made a few years ago about Barack Obama, which, whether Johnson intended it or not, was certainly taken as racist. And when you see the remarks, you can see why. But also, just I think the sense that Johnson is a politician in the of the ilk of Donald Trump, more than one of the ilk of Barack Obama or Joe Biden. So there was little love between them, and from what I'm told, or certainly was told today, that it sounds like the Johnson administration has done little actually to try and build bridges and repair that relationship with the US. So I think I think things are not good. Now, that of course is a different question to the question of whether the US and the UK as countries in the future can still be close allies. And I certainly think that they can be, and that they will be again. But I think it will necessitate a change of government in the UK before bridges can start to be rebuilt.
Joseph Silke, do you agree with that? Do you think it's up to Johnson to reach out to Biden to build bridges? Or do you think in terms of what's happened here, it really is up to the USA to repair global relations?
I think the onus would be more on the USA, to be honest. I mean, clearly things have been better. It was striking how it was Conservative MPs more than any others who usually are so fond of the special relationship who are most critical of American policy in the Commons. But this is a relationship that has ebbed and flowed over the years with high points and low points. Even Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, the closest of political soulmates, they quarreled particularly when America invaded Grenada. And so,
well, yes, but it didn't last long. Sorry to interrupt you. It didn't last long. I mean, we've all heard that call where he says, "Margaret, if I were there, I'd throw my hat into the room before coming in." I mean, and yes, she was furious, but it lasted 3 days. And when, for example, Reagan wanted to bomb Libya, she went away, thought about it for 24 hours, and said yes. I mean, for a long time, the British policy towards America has been to answer the question when Americans say jump, how high, hasn't it?
Well, I think you're absolutely right that America is clearly the senior partner in this relationship. That's obvious. And right now, America has decided that it's shifting its priorities. It wants to focus more on the Far East to combat a rising China. So the UK has to decide what it's going to do about that. And I think the best way forward would be to strengthen our own defence and security capabilities, not only to demonstrate our relevance as a partner to the United States and other allies, but also so that we can act more independently when the situation requires.
Mike, do you think this is strategic? Joseph has just said there that this is part of a repositioning, if you like, that the Americans have withdrawn from Afghanistan in order to deploy resources elsewhere, most especially to tackle the new global threat of the dominance of China. Looking on, it doesn't seem that there's a coherent strategy to do that.
Well, that's how the Americans have presented it, and we won't know whether that's really the case or not for some time to come. But we will be living with the repercussions of the Afghan pullout for many years to come. I mean, this is very, very early days in terms of what this means, both for Afghanistan, but also for international relations and for global security. it obviously means something in terms of the US, the willingness of the US to act as global policeman and indeed to work collaboratively with allies, because they certainly didn't work collaboratively with the UK. And that may, as we referred to, have something to do with the lack of attachment between Biden and Johnson and between the two administrations that we have right now. But actually, this US administration didn't particularly play ball with the rest of NATO either. I mean, if NATO allies were involved in any way, they were informed of what the US was going to do rather than consulted. And if that is the case moving forward, then that has important implications for what the future of NATO looks like.
Yes.
And I mean, as many have said since all this started a couple of weeks ago, what that means for the UK is it means that our European relations are even more important than they were before, not only in terms of economics and trade, which is of course discussed on a daily basis, but also in terms of defence and security. And the fact that we have therefore just left the European Union is I mean, that's another reason why it's unhelpful. It is another reason why those bridges will be rebuilt by a future UK government which sees the world in less partisan eyes than the one that we currently have.
Well, Joseph Silke, Mike Buckley makes a point there that this is yet another complication of Brexit. And of course, I want you to respond to that. But something else that he said, which is worth reflecting on, and I do wonder about this. Do you think a Conservative or a Republican president who had shown such, really the implication of what Mike Buckley said, disregard for NATO, would have been perhaps treated by the press with the degree of softness that some people claim Biden has been treated? Let's say, for example, it was Donald Trump or another Republican president.
Well, Donald Trump was very critical of NATO. He was probably the most disparaging president of it. And this is part of a longer trend. So Obama, when it came to Libya, he wanted the United Kingdom and France to take more of a lead. Of course, we've talked about Donald Trump and now President Biden. So this is part of a wider shift. And I think in terms of the European relations, I'm not entirely convinced that really Brexit has damaged the coordination as much as perhaps it could have done. I think France and Germany, not just on this issue, but also Iran and other issues, have actually been fairly united through the dramas of Brexit regardless. Mm-hmm. And then when it comes to wider relations, still, I think the United Kingdom needs to be more proactive in reaching out to countries like Japan, South Korea, and Australia. People have talked about the idea of a D10, and I think that would be a very sensible way to go.
Now, turning to something different, it's becoming increasingly apparent, to say the very least, when you take a grown-up, reasonable look at what's happening, that we're not going to beat COVID. We can do our best, we can vaccinate, whatever your point of view, we can protect the vulnerable, but ultimately it's going to be a disease that we have to live with. And I started the programme tonight talking about the impact that COVID has had, not just lockdowns, but, for example, most especially perhaps the NHS and people that haven't had access to services because they've been deployed for COVID. Thinking and reflecting on that, the NHS has now been pretty much requisitioned to deal with this one disease. To what extent, Mike Buckley, do we need to really think about that? And do we think the NHS can recover back to the service it was before COVID happened?
It definitely can. I mean, there's no question of that at all. We have the resources in place, we have the staff, we have the infrastructure. A new disease has indeed been added in, and it's unlikely that COVID will ever go away. But we're a wealthy country, we're a capable people. The NHS has more than proven its worth over the last year and a half. And I don't think, I mean, I occasionally, as I'm sure you do, speak to people who work in the NHS, and I absolutely admire all of those people who've dealt with circumstances that in many cases that haven't really been reported, by the press in terms of just how awful it has been on the inside, doubtless out of fear, the desire not to scare the general public. And I think that's a good thing. But actually, there's a hell of a lot of people who work in the NHS who've been through a hell of a lot and still work in the NHS and are still committed and still believe in the worth of what they do and still believe in, the future of the service. So, of course, it can recover. It's simply a question of whether we as a country want to choose that or whether we don't. And actually, in the current circumstances, whether the current government wants to do this or whether it doesn't. If it does, then of course we can. And to say that we can't is is ludicrous, because there's zero reason why that wouldn't be possible. It's simply a question of, is the political will and is the public will to do that? I would imagine the public will be 110% behind the NHS, as they always have been, as always they always are in every poll. The open question is the government going to do what is necessary, and just as importantly, spend what is necessary to enable the NHS to recover?
Joseph Silke, do you think the blank cheque or the spending option is really the critical issue in improving and changing the NHS post-COVID?
I think spending is clearly going to be part of it. There are wider things that we can do in terms of our own personal individual mitigations, doing things like continuing to wear masks where we should help with the pandemic as we go into winter. Things like ensuring that people get vaccinated, not just here at home, but also abroad, to combat this disease globally. And also there's the big project of fixing social care, and that's going to be so important for alleviating all the pressure on the health service. If we don't fix social care, we're going to continue to run into problems. So that needs to be a priority.
Mike Buckley, Joseph Silke, I'm grateful for that. One of the things that emerges here, and it's a gift because it's an opportunity for me to hear and listen to people that very often don't have a platform for their views outside of the shouty of Twitter. It is about really good health information, and above all else, disease prevention. One of the issues that's emerged during the course of COVID has been those with comorbidity factors that really influence and affect your chances of survival of this disease. It's no guarantee, and I want to emphasize that, but amongst other things has been, for example, type 2 diabetes and most especially obesity, for instance. Mike Buckley, do you think the government really needs to now sit back and reflect on how it's going to deploy resources in public information and doing its best to perhaps shift the agenda from treatment to ways that we can prevent people getting disease in the first place?
I'm really glad you brought this up, because I think this is the conversation that we need to be having about health moving forward. We do, of course, need to talk about resourcing. We need to talk about getting the service back to where it was. We need to talk about the fact that the service has been underfunded for over 10 years, and we've, winter crises have become normal where 10 years ago they weren't normal. So all of that has to happen. But in terms of the health service moving forward, social care is really important, and I'm really glad that Joseph mentioned it. But also a shift to prevention and public health is really important. I've spoken to a whole bunch of people over this pandemic who work in public health and have been horrified for a whole bunch of different reasons about the government response to the pandemic, but who've also made the point it's not just COVID. If we actually invested properly in the public health system in this country, then we could prevent many unnecessary illnesses and many deaths. In part, that's about type 2 diabetes, in part, that's about obesity, but it's about a hell of a lot of other things as well. Conditions that people end up living with for years or decades, they don't have to end up living with for years or decades. And what that results in is loads of people turning up at A&E or ending up in hospital or ending up, long-term sick, all of which costs huge amount of money. And actually a bit of education, a bit of investment, and other public health messages and measures earlier in these people's lives could make their lives a hell of a lot better, but also save the NHS a huge amount of money.
Mike Buckley, thank you for that. Joseph Silke, why aren't we having this discussion? Now we know, and I'm taking one instance, I want to emphasise that Mike Buckley made the point that there are a number of issues that require good quality education, but why aren't we having this discussion about the impact of obesity on your chances of survival of COVID? What's going on there? It seems strange to many people.
Well, I think fundamentally the government's afraid of looking a bit too preachy, a bit like it's interfering with people's lives. I think people sometimes get a bit of a sort of libertarian instinct when it comes to the government saying that, well, you should eat less of this, you should drink less of this, you should smoke less. And so it's quite personal in that way, and the government interfering in sort of personalising something that people find a bit uncomfortable. But it is undeniable that that's been a factor. I'm all for encouraging people to, for example, take more exercise. After the first lockdown, when I didn't get as much exercise as I should have done, I decided to do the Couch to 5K, and I found that really rewarding when I finished it. So I'm all for the government having these sorts of schemes, but they've just got to be careful that they don't, make people feel uncomfortable and like they're probing too much into what people consider to be their personal affairs.
Well, I don't want government probing anything, and I certainly, we started the show, don't want the government raising our anxiety levels, but a sensible approach to education. And above all, good social health requires more than just money. It requires a grown-up, mature way at looking about how we can prevent disease as well as treat it. Thank you so much, Mike Buckley, journalist and campaigner, and Joseph Silke, communications officer at Bright Blue. That was our political panel. Now, after the break,